So next up, let's take a look at this prompt. Greed is both the cornerstone and the tragic flaw of globalization. As a consequence, natural inequalities emerge. So, the last essay that we looked at together, the main theme was the nature of mankind. This one's looking at kind of the dual nature of mankind and globalization. Because it's suggesting that the nature of globalization is that it's shaped by greed, because greed is our nature. So if this was our prompt, then it would be absolutely essential to define greed. So I'm going to take you through a little bit of breaking this source down. If the big rocks are greed and cornerstone, tragic flaw, natural inequalities, those are the things that we should define in our analysis. What is greed? Is greed good or bad? Explore the division of society around the concept of greed. Why use the term cornerstone? Greed is both the cornerstone and the tragic flaw of globalization. What does it mean to be a cornerstone needs to be explored in that intro. What is a cornerstone? Architecturally, what does that mean? And what does it mean to have a tragic flaw? As a consequence, natural inequalities emerge. What do these inequalities look like? How are they measured? Give me examples. So in the intro, in the analysis, yes, we're trying to unpack an ideological perspective of the source. We're also unpacking a conversation that the source is creating. And it's important to really define and explore, to analyze the big rocks of that conversation. So this conversation, we need to look for greed. We need to figure out what is greed. So in this next unit of the year, that's something that every day you need to be looking for. How do I see greed today? Because we will be writing this one. How do I see greed today? How do I see natural inequalities? What does it mean that inequalities are natural? Well, why use the word natural in front of inequalities? How does that change the idea of inequalities? If it's a natural inequality, if it's natural, does that mean it's right? So if there's inequalities, social inequalities, economic inequalities, political inequalities that result from greed, then are those inequalities natural? Are they right? Should we be working against them if they are natural? So that is something to look for too, is inequality natural? Is it natural for the strong to feed on the weak? So that's something to be looking for throughout this unit 4. Evidence of inequality between the strong and the weak. So there is an essay linked there that looks at the quote from the Greeks, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. And much of that essay is transferable to this essay that we're writing. So as we learn some ancient history, look for that kind of relationship. When we globalize, when we connect, do the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must? We have evidence that that's what defines a relationship. So before we can write this essay, one of the first things I would say we need to do is define greed. Now, some may say greed is good. And there is a YouTube video that's very short from the movie Wall Street that looks at greed being good. So this is the controversy, this is the division of society. Because the source is painting greed as a negative quality of man. And this is going to show it to be good.
But evolution in corporate America seems to be survival of the unfittest. Well, in my book, you either do it right, or you get eliminated. In the last 7 deals that I've been involved with, there were 2.5 million stockholders who have made a pre-tax profit of $12 billion. Thank you. I am not a destroyer of companies. I am a liberator of them. point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all of its forms. Greed for life, for money, for love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind, and greed, you mark my words, will not only save Teldar Paper, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the USA. Thank you very much.
So one thing that you can expect to do by the end of the year is write a paragraph that explores greed. And in that paragraph that explores greed, you need to have evidence that illustrates, that defends the argument that greed is good, and you need to have evidence that greed is bad. So as we actually begin the course now, that intro was just kind of an intro to get some of the language down, like globalization. Now that we're starting the actual history part of the course tomorrow, I want you to begin to take inventory of the evidence that we come up, the evidence that we end up studying. And there will be some evidence that will defend the argument greed is good, and there will be evidence that attacks the argument that greed is good. And we need to take note of both of those to continue to develop that essay. Also, to look at that essay, greed is both the cornerstone and the tragic flaw of globalization. As a consequence, natural inequalities emerge. We have a related Prezi here. So, words like cornerstone, building blocks, tragic flaws, you have to dive into the language that's being used. Now, what's the significance of the language? We're talking about architecture. The source is about building. So the foundation, the cornerstone. If you have a cornerstone, that's the original rock that you build a structure on. If you have a cornerstone that's flawed, all other stones that will be laid after it will also be flawed, because that's the stone that they try to see as truth. So if you have a flawed original stone, the structure will be flawed, and it will be condemned to be failure. It will fail, it will collapse. So if you see greed as a flawed cornerstone, then anything, including capitalism, or in this case globalization, that is built on greed will end up being a house that will collapse. So a cornerstone is the essential foundation for a structure. The strength of the entire structure depends upon that initial stone. You remove the cornerstone, the structure would collapse. But the problem is, some cornerstones may be flawed, so then the building won't be built to last. Economics, globalization. Globalization often is defined by our economic activities, and economics is a key pillar for the establishment of society. It is important to have a sustainable, ethical foundation. So if economics is a pillar for society, and we want a sustainable society, is greed sustainable? So in your essay on greed, you'll have to look at the sustainability of greed. Maybe we can only have a future as a species because of greed. The greed will unlock innovation. Or maybe due to greed we're irrational and will lead to the death of birth. It'll be yours to explore. So what is a good cornerstone? What might be a bad cornerstone? And then you can look at terms like fatal flaws. So to explore the concept of fatal flaw introduced in the source, you might say, okay, where have I seen that term fatal flaw before? Achilles had a fatal flaw. Because of his fatal flaw, this near immortal ended up being defeated because he had that Achilles heel, his fatal flaw. So you could introduce the legend of Achilles to further explore the fact that greed is a cornerstone, but also a tragic or fatal flaw of globalization. that it's a tragic flaw that will be fatal, much like Achilles' heel was his tragic flaw as well. There's also within this source an opportunity to explore ethics and morality. So within the source, you have an opportunity to define what is ideal characters of our nature of man. Is it ideal that we are selfish or selfless? Should we be promoting our self-interest or the collective interest? What should our motivations be? What defines a good life? Is it about serving ourselves and our family, or should we be serving our community? And there was a quote that we saw from Gordon Gekko. The point is, ladies and gentlemen, that greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is good. So greed captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit he suggested. So the good news about social studies is to build a strong essay, even in hypothetical case studies like the film Wall Street, there may be some arguments that you can use. There may be arguments that you can use to add to the sophisticated nature of your writing. That quote, that line, greed captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit, that could be a springboard for you to then go and provide some evidence to prove that. Look at the greed behind SpaceX and the stuff that SpaceX has been able to accomplish, because at heart, SpaceX is a private corporation that is making a profit. So greed captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. But others, like Bud Fox, might say there's no nobility in poverty. So that's the thing about social studies, is we're not here to indoctrinate you. We're the least likely class in the building to indoctrinate. We're here to show you multiple opinions. So we have the greed is good. That's the opinion of pro-globalists and pro-capitalists, and definitely the UCP government that is trying to put Alberta back to work. But then there's people that say, but if greed creates a disparity, if greed does allow natural inequalities to merge, as the source suggests, well, then there's no nobility in those who will be poor. So what do we expect from them? Should we not expect a violent revolution from, even if it's not 99% that are impoverished, from whatever fraction it is, should we not expect them to rise up? Is greed a fair, sustainable, desirable characteristic of individuals and nations? Is greed the will of Canadian people? So, definitely something to do is to break down language. And globalization, the global market today, is defined as a global free market, a capitalist market. So we have some time to go back to that capitalism from grade 9 social studies. Who might agree that capitalism's fatal flaw is greed? So Karl Marx would. So this source that we're looking at gives us an opportunity to explore economic theory. Adam Smith would say greed is great. Greed is the cornerstone. It unleashes the invisible hand. And that's how we unlock the wealth of a nation. Marx will say because of greed we have class warfare, class conflict. That only, yes, it does allow natural inequalities to emerge, but these inequalities are inhumane. Keeping in mind we still have 5 minutes. Who might argue that greed is an ultimate building block, but not a fatal flaw? So some people may say, yeah, you know what, you're right about greed, but you're only right partly. You're right that it should be a cornerstone, it's a building block, but it's not a fatal flaw, and that's where you have Adam Smith. So then we begin to collect historical and theoretical and contemporary evidence to support our argument. And that's going to be your job over the next few weeks. So this is an essay that we're writing. This is an essay that's assigned right now. And that's an essay that you're going to be working on day to day. Each day in each lesson, you need to look and say, how have we explored this today? I'll come by with your wipe so you wipe down your Chromebooks and desks and move on to your next class.